My sermon title today is quite obvious. It's on the screen. Who sits on the throne? Now, that question is a prompt. It is something I want you to think about. I want you to wonder. I want you to evaluate a little bit and ask the question along with that. Well, what is the throne? What is it that influences you the most? Is basically what that question is. What is it that gives direction to your life and helps you work through the tough times? What is it that helps you guide the decisions you make? Who sits on the throne? It's a good question to ask, and it's a good question to answer, because the answer to the question, that's a good answer. Because the answer to the question may determine your eternal destiny. That's a pretty heavy thing to start the sermon out with. But I decided to start at the end, and let's work backwards from there. I don't know if you've ever done a big project or done any type of planning or things, but really that's the best way to approach a project. You know what your end goal is, and then you take that end goal and say, all right, in order for this end goal to be achieved, I've got to go back and do this and this and this and this and all the steps and all the things that it takes to get that. And I want us to think about that in light of our end goal, eternal life. Who is it? What is it? What are the things that we need to understand? What are the things that we need to do to achieve that end goal? There are a lot of things on this earth that influence us, aren't there? Or a lot of things that try to get us to kind of jump on board with their plan, with their ideas, with their direction. Well, last week I started this sermon series in the book of Colossians, and the theme for the sermon series is Supreme Living. Because I want us to understand what it is to live supreme on this earth as well as in heaven. But as you look at it and as we live in this earth, most things are geared towards this earth, right? You know, there's a lot of things that are trying to get our attention. Let me just throw out a few things here. Resort-style living. You ever heard anything like that here in Southwest Florida? Living well, staying active, ready for what's next. All right. Well, and that is good. There's nothing wrong with a place like that. But when it says what's next, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're going to just get better, better, and better? Probably not. They're wanting you to prepare for the things that maybe might come as we near the end of our life. What your final days on earth will be like. Well, how about this? This is one of many you could pick up. You may not be able to read that small print, but it talks about comprehensive financial guidance and all these. On the last line, there's legacy and generational planning, which is good. It's good to do that. But there again, what's that implying? You're not going to be around forever. So while you're here on this earth, let us make it as good as you can possibly make it. What about this? Fuel your fitness journey. Replenish and rebuild the mind, body, and soul. And that's not a bad thing whatsoever. But I have a feeling that the soul they're talking about is not necessarily maybe the same thing that we would think of when it comes to eternity. So what's interesting about all those examples there is that they all hint at spiritual things, whether they're obvious or not. But those are all dynamics that we will have to deal with. And they're things in our lives. But these things can only do one thing. They can only take care of what's here on earth. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to prepare for more than what just we have here on this earth? Well, the good news, there is. And the passage we're going to look at today, and as we go through the book of Colossians, I think this passage today is one of the most powerful passages in the New Testament. In fact, when I planned out this sermon series, I was going to do 1 week on chapter 1. And as I mentioned last week, I said, that's too much. We're going to spend 3 weeks on chapter 1. What I thought I was going to cover today, I've divided up into 2 sermons, and we'll get the second half next week. Because these passages are so powerful. And we need to grasp, and we need to understand really the impact of what they have on our lives for eternity. So I'm going to look at Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 23 today, and we're going to start out with the first section. And Paul says, Now this is speaking of Jesus, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. Now that's enough to dwell on a couple months right there. When you begin thinking about those things. Who is Jesus? Why would Paul even need to talk about that? Well, some of the background, who he's writing to, the Christians at Colossae in that first century when Christianity was a new faith, a new religion. There were other people coming along and they were trying to blend stuff together and take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There was people that would say that Jesus couldn't have had an earthly body because they thought all flesh was evil. So therefore, Jesus was merely a spiritual being. Others would say that the world would have been created by a lesser God because in their eyes all matter was evil and a holy God couldn't have anything to do with matter here on earth. And then they would say that salvation comes only by a special secret knowledge, a spiritual understanding of who God was, and basically those who agreed with them, those were the ones that would find salvation. So in that culture, to those people, when there are all kinds of opposing views and different ideas being spun out there, Paul says, all right, I want to clarify something. Right off the start, chapter 1 here, I want you to know who Jesus is. And I want you to know how magnificent He is and how big He is. And that's why he starts off this chapter. And I want to look at just two things today that hopefully will help us understand that He needs to be on the throne. Who He is and what we need to do are very important things. And the first thing is this: Christ is the Creator, and He deserves your worship. He deserves your worship. Verse 15, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. As Robert was mentioning earlier, there are things here beyond our scope of really grasping all of that. Like, whoa. But let's just think about that. John says this in the opening of his gospel. And I like the way John says is that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that reference to the Word there is a reference to Jesus. And in John 14, on down in that same chapter, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So the writer in the Gospels, John, says that Jesus was in the beginning, and He was with God, and He was God, and then He came down to earth to live with us. Basically reinforces what Paul says there in verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. He is God in flesh. He is Creator. For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth. And I just got to thinking about that. His creation. I just want to give you a couple examples. Man, we could spend the rest of the day looking at things in creation. But this is actually a picture I took several years ago. Drove up and noticed in my daughter's car, that's back when they still had antennas, this dragonfly had latched on. And I took a picture of this dragonfly. And if you look at the head, I do the laser, but the TV screen up there swallows. You can kind of see it there. That on the side of the dragonfly is its eyeball. Now, bioengineering and engineering people have studied nature for years to try to figure out how to fly and how to maneuver. They studied birds way back when they started talking about man flying in a machine. The dragonfly is one of those amazing creatures that it can fly vertically, horizontally, it can hover, can quickly move, and always seems to know where it's going. Why? Well, that eyeball, most of the head is an eye on the dragonfly, if you ever get one up close and look at it. In each eye, there are 30,000 separate units. And each one of those units can gather data, what it sees, and it is transmitted through its brain, and all those images come together into a mosaic of what it looks like. Now, how do they really know that? I have no clue. Did one of the scientists become a dragonfly one day and, oh, wow, this is really cool? No, but I'm going to take it for granted that they can count the number of eyeballs and all that stuff. But that's amazing to think that God created that by a spoken word. What about the human eye? Imagine walking into a room, and in the room you have a collection of some of the smartest people in the world when it comes to optics, and NASA engineers and MIT graduates and people from Sony and Apple, and they all get together, and their task is to design a camera that matches the function of the human eyeball. Well, they get to work, they design lenses with incredible zoom, they create sensors with millions of pixels, they build processors that can adjust to light in milliseconds, they add autofocus and image stabilization and color correction and all of that, and after years of work and after billions of dollars, they step back and look at their masterpiece, and then someone quietly says, you know what? It still can't do what a newborn baby's eyes does without trying. Because the human eye autofocuses faster than any camera ever built, processes 10 million bits of information per second, adjusts to darkness 10 times faster than any night vision technology. It self-cleans, self-corrects, self-lubricates, self-repairs. It connects through the brain through 1 million fiber optic nerve. It flips the world upside down, actually right side up, because the images that you see actually hit your retina upside down. It does all of this silently, instantly, and continuously. One scientist said if we were to create a camera equal to the human eye, it would have to be 576 megapixels. Now, that didn't mean anything to me when I read that. But, all right, let's compare that. We're all familiar with the iPhone and the latest iPhone. And, all the upgrades on phones nowadays is just basically they brag a better camera. Basically, that's basically what it is. And the newest camera that Apple has is 48 megapixels compared to 576 they say it would take to even match the human eyeball's capability. If the world's smartest people can't build an eyeball, what does that say about the Creator who spoke it into existence? David said it long before science ever came up with the idea or could do anything. It says, I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. The eye is not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It is a signature. It's a signature of a Creator who sees, a designer who knows, and a God who formed you and I with intention, purpose, and precision. Jesus is our Creator, and He deserves our worship. Jesus is our Creator, and He deserves our worship because He holds all things together. Imagine, it's hard to do around here, but have you ever been in one of those areas where it's all dark and it's a clear, starry, beautiful night? Imagine standing and gazing into the universe. You've probably all done that one time. And it looks so peaceful, twinkle, twinkle, little star, I wonder what you are. But actually, it is a universe with breathtaking motion. The earth, now, when I read all this stuff, I've got to check this out. So I checked these things out at a couple of different sources because, honestly, I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't understand it when it said it. But the earth is spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. Okay? while spinning, it's orbiting the sun 67,000 miles per hour. And the sun itself is racing around the center of the Milky Way galaxy at 490,000 miles per hour. And the Milky Way galaxy is traveling through space at 1.3 million miles per hour. Yet you and I can sit on our lanai and skip coffee and not be flung off this earth. Don't even feel vibration. How in the world does that work? Well, because every planet, every star, every galaxy is moving in perfect mathematical harmony. If the Earth spun slightly faster, we would be thrown off of it, like a rider off of a horse. If it would spin slightly slower, then one side would burn and the other side would freeze as it rotates. If the moon were a little bit closer, it would affect the tide so much that where we're sitting today, we'd all need snorkels to sit here. If gravity were a fraction weaker or stronger, the stars could not form the planets, they could not orbit, and life could not exist. Scientists call this fine-tuning. Paul calls it Jesus. Colossians 1:17 doesn't say that the universe holds itself together. It says, and in Him all things hold together. The universe is not a machine running on its own. It's a symphony held together by a great conductor, and His name is Jesus. And Jesus is creator. He is sustainer. And He deserves our worship. Well, Paul goes on from there. In the following verses, it says Christ is the head. And He deserves your obedience. Verse 18. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything He might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Wow. Jesus is supreme. Verse 18, He is the head of the body, the church. Now, who's the head of the church? Well, the Pope is not the head of the church. The greatest TV evangelist is not the head of the church. Some mega church pastor is not the head of the church. Some minister in a small church is not the head of the church. The only one who deserves that title is Jesus Christ, who is the head of the church. And when leaders in the church and when people in the church forget that, it no longer is a church. It's simply a social club meant to meet their personal needs. Jesus is the head of the church. That's amazing. And it's something we must never forget. Paul says He is the head of the body. In a culture in the first century when all kinds of things were going on and all kinds of people were trying to proclaim supremacy, the emperor in Rome was saying, you've got to follow me. The local officials were saying, you've got to follow me because I'm in the authority of the Roman emperor. When certain teachers would say, you've got to follow my teaching, Paul says, no, you guys got it all wrong. It's Jesus who is the head of the church. And what did that mean? How did that all come together? Well, in verse 19, for God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him. God's fullness dwelt in Jesus. And here's one of those mind-boggling things. How did God come to earth in flesh through Jesus Christ? Well, He did it because He is God and we are not. And there will still be mysteries of this life that we will not understand. But I love what Paul says in 1 Corinthians when he says, one day, in chapter 13, says, one day, now I see through a glass dimly, but one day I shall see face to face. Paul was humble enough to admit he hasn't gotten it all figured out. But he's sure looking forward to the day when he will. And that's where our faith comes in. And Paul, when the false teachers of his day tried to diminish who Jesus is, Paul just right up front confronts the issue and says, no, you need to know that Jesus is the creator, the sustainer of this world we live in, and he is the head of the church, which you are now pledging your allegiance to him. And when people today try to diminish who Jesus is, don't be afraid to confront him head on. Jesus is Lord. 20, verse 20. And through him all things, he came to reconcile to himself things, whether things on heaven and on earth or things in heaven. And when I read that, I thought, I really think it's a reference even back to the Garden of Eden. He came to reconcile all things through him. What happened in the Garden of Eden? Well, in the Garden of Eden is when things got messed up. Things were in perfect harmony in the Garden of Eden before sin entered in. But when sin entered in, God comes down and says, hey, where you guys been? And has that conversation with them. And he says, the earth is going to now, grown, and it's going to have thorns and thistles and things on earth that you're going to do. And then the separation between mankind and God took place because of sin. And what could not be reconciled through all the animal sacrifices, through all the Old Testament, through all the battles that were fought, through all the different kings and kingdoms that came along, it could never reconcile things. And yet Paul says here, he reconciled by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. In the garden, it all broke down. On the cross, he brought it all together. He reconciled, lined things up, brought them back the way they should be. So in light of all of this, in light of who Jesus is and who this world tries to say is and things, who sits on your throne? Christ is the head. And he deserves your obedience. Not because of anything we have done, but because of everything that he has done. And every one of us will walk out of this room with someone on the throne or something on the throne. And what sits on that throne makes such a big difference in the decisions we make, the directions we go, how we handle life. But Paul reminds us that there is only one worthy to sit on the throne. There's only one who created you and the heavens and the dragonflies and our eyeballs. He is our God. And there's only one who redeemed you. There's only one who can reconcile all the accounts that you have. If your life was put out on a spreadsheet, it'd probably look like a mess. And yet he can reconcile all of those things and bring them together. So the question really is not, is Christ on the throne? The question is Christ on your throne? You see, the first question's already been answered. He sits on the throne. The second question has yet to be answered by you.